Well, welcome to SUMA Convention. It feels like we were just here a year ago, only in Saskatoon. It does feel like it was just yesterday, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for one of the many education sessions this afternoon. And this one, just so you know, and you're in the right room if this is the one you want to attend, is Bolt Down Good Infrastructure with Engineers. My name is Dawn Looning. I'm a SUMA Board of Director and also a City Councillor in the City of Moose Jaw. Before we get into the session, and I've just started it a little bit early because our presenters said to me beforehand that they're probably going to use up a lot of the time, if not all of it. So we're just getting started a little bit earlier. But before we get into it, I want to quickly note that the emergency exits and the automatic external defibrillator location are marked on pages 24 to 25 of your convention handbook. We want to make sure our delegates are safe, so when you have a minute, please familiarize yourself with that information. And expect to be reminded of this a few more times throughout convention. Your safety is, of course, very important to us. Please note also that this session is being recorded. So this means that if you want to ask a question after the presenters are finished, we need you to come up to the microphone and speak clearly to identify yourself and your municipality when asking your question. Later this month, the presentations will be available on the SUMA YouTube channel, and we want those recordings to be a good resource, so we need all of your questions clearly recorded. When we plan events for our members, we try to tailor the topics and speakers for your needs. The full bios for all of the speakers today are available on our convention app, Event Base. Please give them your full attention and be open to how their information can apply to your municipality. Some lessons will be easier to apply than others, but I'm sure everyone in this room will be able to use many aspects of this information when you go back to your offices. This session is sponsored by ISL Engineering, and we have Rob Schlodnick from the Saskatoon office. He's the manager there, here on their behalf to introduce our speakers. So please show our thanks for the sponsor for this session. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Don. First off, I want to say thanks to SUMA for providing us all with this opportunity. We have some important infrastructure projects to talk about for our future, and it couldn't be a better time. With approximately 1,000 registered delegates this year, it's nice to see such a wide representation of people invested in growing a strong Saskatchewan. At ISL Engineering and Land Services, we are committed to inspiring sustainable thinking in transportation, land, and water projects. I've had the pleasure of working my entire career in Saskatchewan for public and private sector clients, and over this time, I've seen how essential it is to plan for and maintain the infrastructure that supports our way of life. Whether it's a bridge rehabilitation project like the Idlewild Drive Overpass in Saskatoon that I recently worked on, or a complicated water project like the Sask Landing Regional Water Pipeline Utility, it couldn't be more important to make sound engineering decisions for today and future generations. So with that being said, it's my special excitement, and I'm pleased to welcome the Bolt Down for Good Infrastructure Engineers panel. This group is composed of specialists who understand the value of good engineering, the challenges of limited funding, and the importance of meeting regulatory standards. This panel will demystify the infrastructure deficit challenges we face in Saskatchewan and provide us with some practical funding ideas moving forward. Please join me in welcoming AECOM Executive Director Beverly MacLeod, Manager of Engineering and Approvals for Saskatchewan Water Security Agency, Ryan Evans, AECOM Chair of Environment and Water Resources Committee, Sean Bayer, Municipal Infrastructure Manager for AECOM, Ryan King, and Assistant Deputy Minister with Ministry of Government Relations, Keith Comstock.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Again, my name is Bev MacLeod. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Consulting Engineering Companies right here in Saskatchewan. I'm not an engineer personally, but I'm very proud to represent this great profession. I learn something new from all of my members every single day. I'm here to just do a really short introduction and tell you what it is that consulting engineers do and some of their observations about the Saskatchewan municipal infrastructure. So, what is a consulting engineer? A consulting, oh my goodness. Can everybody hear me? We've got a party going next door. Can everybody hear me over top of the music here? Okay, fair enough. So when you hear the word engineer, the first thing that you're typically hearing or thinking of is somebody who's a technical expert. That's pretty common. Most people, they associate engineer with a technical expert, but there's so much more. How many people here know that they are beholden to legislation to protect the public safety? Show of hands. How many people here knew that? Okay, that's good. Are you also aware that engineers design, when they design, they actually sort of determine the materials that get used in order to meet a certain standard? How many people here understand that engineers actually contribute to determining what materials get used into the construction of your... That's good. Okay. Now, recognize though that with technical expertise, they also help you understand how long an asset will last. And that's something that I want to focus on here for just a moment more. When we're looking at what a consulting engineer does, they're also business experts, okay? So I want to give you an example. I've got one member in particular, and a lot of my members will say the same thing. It can take, an engineer can build a bridge that's going to last you 100 years, but that's cost prohibitive. That's not something that would probably be realistic in this world. So an engineer's job is to advise on how to spend your infrastructure dollars the most efficiently, okay? So somebody might tell you that, oh, you don't need this thing, whatever this thing happens to be, into the particular infrastructure project that you're working on. And whoever that person is right to the extent that you may not need it right this very second. But what engineers do is give you observations and recommendations about maybe you need this thing to help your infrastructure last 30 years instead of 20 years. So they're giving you some options for you to consider on how to most efficiently invest your money. So that is why they're business experts. They can say to you, okay, maybe you don't need it, but maybe this liner is 50 grand. That liner is only going to last you 2 years. Maybe you need to go with this material, and it's going to allow this entire thing to last an extended period much longer, okay? So this is the kind of business expertise that they bring to the table. So moving on, these are some of the observations that engineers see in the municipalities here in Saskatchewan today. We all recognize that there's a significant demand. We all recognize that none of us have as much money to do as we want to do, never mind what we need to do. We have funders who have constraints as well. They're working with priorities dictated by various levels of government, different orders of government, and there are limitations and timelines within those things as well. And also now we're faced with regulators who've got looming deadlines around regulation. So these are all of the things that engineers see on a daily basis, and they're concerned about how we as a province move forward. So one of the things that I said is that they act as a go-between. They go between different stakeholders, and they talk to various experts. And one of the things that really, really is important is to take a look at those efficiencies. They have been played an integral role in that regionalization discussion, and that is one of the things that we want to talk to you about today. We want to speak about regionalization benefits and how we can all work together. I need for you to recognize that this is an infrastructure spending topic only. Engineers are not here to talk about anything around policy around merging municipalities or anything like that. This is strictly an efficiency discussion around infrastructure. So the next person who's going to come up here now is going to talk about a very specific project that was very complex, but by happy coincidence was also a regionalization project, and he can give you all of the details. I'd like to introduce Ryan King.
Thanks, Bev. Just for you, those of you in the crowd, I've given this particular project presentation many times, so I'll be moving quite quickly through it, both because I know it so well and our time constraints. So this is, like Bev alluded to, a success story. It's more of a journey, though, of how a project can really start from a need of neighboring municipalities and turn into something much more. And so I'll walk you through how this all started. And it's the client formed a legal entity. These are the original 6 municipalities that got together on this project and this objective. So you can see three small urban municipalities and three RMs. The purpose was, like I said, really quite innocent. They all had the same objective, and this coincidentally happened in 2002. So if you remember, 2001 is when drinking water really came into focus in the country after Walkerton and North Battleford. So the need for good, sound, reliable drinking water was kind of at the forefront of everyone's minds then. So in this particular region in west central Saskatchewan, water quality is a concern. There's obviously the river running through the area, but sometimes water bodies and water sources are few and far between. All these municipalities were struggling with the same thing besides water quality. Some of their members, especially out in the RMs, didn't have piped water, and their systems were very, very old and very basic. So they got together as a group to talk about what they could do. And like I said, it was very innocent. PFRA was available and helped them get together and talk about these issues. So again, this is the location map. If you can, it's kind of hard to see, but you can see kind of Saskatoon and then down Rosetown, Elrose, Kyle. So the project is quite expansive, but it kind of centers around Highway 4, running north and south in west central Saskatchewan, and obviously Sask Landing, the park, is located at the very south end of the system. So again, after they got together, they kind of proceeded very slowly, very methodically. It wasn't a real project. It wasn't anything other than exploring, is there a better way to get potable water to our communities? So they initially started with a feasibility study. If we wanted to undertake a water project as a group, is this even possible? So you can see the timelines from 2002 to 2008. You know, it didn't happen overnight. They undertook these studies. They looked at all the different water sources where they could supply this regional water system. And then in the end, they decided Lake Diefenbaker, which is the biggest water body, was the most cost prohibitive to actually pull water out of, and you know, we could spend another half an hour talking about why that's the case, but we can talk afterwards at the Patriots game on that. So then they looked at groundwater as a source. You know, that's really the two source water in Saskatchewan. It's either groundwater or surface water. So they developed, you know, some ideas, a north and south system. They looked at the aquifers. They undertook some drilling, you know, so this was all scientific. It wasn't just guessing. And really, you know, after they drilled some wells, you know, so they did sink capital money into this as they were proceeding through this decision-making process from 2002 to 2008. You know, really, if the wells could produce enough water to supply a regional system, then they'd probably proceed to the next step. If this phase of work would have said no, the aquifers in the area can't supply enough water to the system, then it probably would have died right there. So they went through that. That hydrogeological work proved, yes, there is enough water in the below ground aquifers to supply this system. So then they moved to the next step. Again, there's no roadmap to this. They're just, you know, with PFRA's assistance, they said, okay, what's the next thing we need to do? So they applied for money, because you can't do anything without money these days. and they were very lucky to get 10.2 million, so 50-cent dollars, from the Canadian Strategic Infrastructure Fund. It was one of 4 grants in the province, and really I think that's when they realized this was something real. You don't get $10 million every day, and I think really the only reason they got that money is because governments, whether it's provincial or federal, look very favorably on municipalities working together on a common cause. So that was certainly key. So then they formed a legal entity and they moved to the next step, which was hiring engineers, and luckily us. So when we were hired in '08, we undertook everything they were going to need to do that project, and it was quite expansive. And with the $10 million they got from both the province and the feds, comes some special tasks, you know, and environmental assessments, and you really have to do the full level of service when you get this infrastructure money. So we undertook all those tasks. It was the first year was a lot of open houses, a lot of talking to people, about who wants water. You know, it was very basic questions because, you know, they got together as councils to discuss this as an objective. Now they were going out to people in their towns and RMs to say, who wants this? Who wants this water? How much water do you want? It's a key question. And how much is it going to cost? And so it's kind of it turns into a circular, you know, discussion sometimes, because you ask people questions and then they ask you questions and then you can't answer. And, you know, for instance, you can't say, they ask you, how much is it going to cost? And then you ask them, how much water do you want? And it goes around and around, and eventually you gotta find your way. You gotta navigate a path. So in the end, this is just a map of the system. The different colors represent different changes in elevation. This is the north system, so this is kind of from Elrose going north, and you know, the blue is not a water body, it's just a lower elevation, so this map alone proves that Saskatchewan isn't flat. There's about 180 meters of elevation change just in this system. In the north, in the south, which goes down to Lake Diefenbaker, so the blue in this is actually water at the south. You know, you can see the massive changes in elevations. Now all those lines on there, the purple lines represent pipelines that were actually installed. The yellow dots, which are really hard to see, are individual users in the countryside. And with each of those individual users, they told us through all those one-on-one discussions how much water they wanted. So some people wanted, the minimum was 1 gallon a minute. You know, some people wanted 25 gallons a minute. And if people could go back now that it's running, they'd probably want even more water, you know. It's kind of it's a leap of faith, I called it really at the time, because you're talking about something at such a massive scale in rural Saskatchewan, and I think there was a real apprehension of, is this actually going to be built? You know, is this actually going to happen? So when it did happen, that changed a lot of minds in a hurry. You know, we'd be coming with the pipeline and there'd be people signing on 2 miles down the road, but you needed that base amount of people that took that leap of faith, that believed that this could be built in order for it to happen. So, so we went through design, went through tendering. As you can see, we identified a cost of $51 million. So if you can imagine sitting around the table with 6 municipalities, relatively small municipalities, and that's a big number. You know, that's a big number to the biggest municipalities in this province, let alone, you know, small to medium. So it takes a lot of, it took a lot of courage, I'd say, for them to keep moving forward on putting that thing together when they have such a big number like that. I think one thing, maybe we'll get to it here in a minute. The one thing maybe that got cut out of the slideshow is they did get a second grant. So besides the 10 million, they also were successful on a second grant where they got 16 million, roughly. So that was kind of for distribution in the rural areas. So overall, out of that 51, you know, if you're doing the math in your head, you know, they got 26 million from different levels of government. So we went through tendering. There was 5 different construction contracts, 2 pipeline contracts, booster station reservoirs to get the water moving around, and 2 water plant contracts. So there's a lot going on, a lot of different contractors, different types of work. So when the dust settled after tendering, the phase 1, we'll call it, contracts were slightly under budget, and the phase 2 contracts were slightly over budget. But overall, it was a pretty big success on what we were trying to accomplish here. So the phase 2, which is the rural side, those contracts were over budget, and those users that it would affect were the most sensitive, because if you know, they're the farms, the ranches, the things that, you know, were most sensitive to the cost initially. So an increase would be significant. So kind of during and just after tender, the project started to lose support. You know, it's hard, you know, it's probably hard to work around your table with, you know, some days with just your own council, and then so if you have 6 councils sitting around the same table, you can imagine, you know, the harmony that you try to keep going here on a project like this. So it did start to lose support. And, you know, it really came down to sum it up. Some communities really needed this. Of the 6, some communities really needed it more than others. So it came down to a need versus a want, you know, and that's where it started to kind of crumble a little bit. Now, it couldn't be overcome. It could not be overcome with that group. So all that work, this is 2010 now, so all 8 years of work, it couldn't move forward, and 2 of the members withdrew. So I always say this would be the lamest presentation ever if that's where I stopped. So luckily, after that major milestone in the project, we'll call it, where 2 of the founding members pulled out, the 4 remaining had a common goal still. They still fundamentally, when they met in 2002, had the same objective, and that was to get good, safe water for their communities. So they continued on, believe it or not. And like I said, it's not a story about a failure of one of the largest regional water systems before it was ever built. So the 4 remaining municipalities forged on, and we redesigned the north because one of the municipalities that pulled out, we were going to expand their water plant. So after the redesign, we went to tender again, picked ourselves up off the mat as well, you know, because by this point, you know, we're very much, I don't want to say living and dying with whether the project goes ahead or not, but you certainly don't want to see all this effort, all this time, and nothing gets built out of it, and people are left with the same water systems they had in 2002. So the south system luckily didn't require much redesign because it was municipalities in the north that pulled out, so it was really only the north that required a bit of redesign. Revised project submitted to the different levels of government. The funding was staying intact, so really it was a green light to proceed with this revised group of 4 municipalities and different size project. So just to run you quickly through, like, this will give you an idea, I guess, of the reason we include this is to give you an idea of the scope and the size of what we got accomplished here. Contract 1 was called transmission pipelines, transmission mains. It was the bigger pipe diameters, and I think there was about 100 kilometers in that specific contract, and it was a value of $6.5 million. Brand new water plant in Elrose to serve the north system. That was at a value of $4.5 million. The south water plant in Kyle, again about $4.5 million. So then there was 2 more contracts. There was the booster station reservoir, and there was also contract 5. There we go. So booster station reservoir was about $2 million. There was 2 booster stations and 3 reservoirs out in the countryside to get the water to all these people we're talking about an expansive area here. So, you know, contract 5 was the rural pipelines. That involved about 700 kilometers of water pipeline. So it really, you know, it's not like we were staying tight to the communities. We were covering huge areas in that neck of the woods. So, you know, even if you were 50 miles away from town, you were still getting treated water, as good a water as somebody living right in town. So, you know, that's obviously one of the key things. The raw water supply to these water plants, again, that was another 500,000. So it just kind of, we could keep going and going here. We had a waste injection well to get rid of the processed wastewater in the north system because of the treatment systems were quite different. It was a lot harder to treat the water in the north. The water coming out of that aquifer, which is the Tyner aquifer, very poor, lots of it, but very poor, so it required intensive treatment, which generated, in this case, a lot of wastewater. So overall, that gives you an idea. Those weird colored shaped blobs are pressure zones. So if you can imagine those blue lines as pipelines, this is the north and south all combined. And again, this is just the area we covered. There was different pressure zones serving different folks. And to give you an idea, there's a reservoir 10 kilometers south of Elrose sitting on a hill. And we pumped to that reservoir on a hill. And basically the reason we put it on that hill is it's at a right elevation to act as a water tower. So we pumped to that reservoir, and then it gravity feeds hundreds of kilometers. So it gravity feeds all the way to Dinsmore, for those of you that know that part of the country. So to use Mother Nature and not having a pump running all the time, you know, there's lots of little things we did on this job to try to use the land to minimize costs, you know, for operation, and that's just one little thing in that job. We'll just run through this quick. The north system, it serviced the town of Elrose, 109 rural users, the village of Wyston, and those were the major users. Like I said, the north system was supplied from the Tyner aquifer, which is very poor water. And the reservoir I alluded to, Manette South Reservoir, which is called the, I forget off the top of my head actually, but we pumped to that reservoir, which acts as a water tower, and gravity feeds a huge amount of users in that area. We had a booster station north of town, wartime booster station. So the south system serviced the town of Kyle, 127 rural users, Kyle Hutterick Colony, Sask Landing Park, Hamlet of White Bear. Pretty simple treatment plant in a way. Good water coming out of the Kyle aquifer, so again, the treatment process was not near as intensive as at the north. We had one reservoir called Horse Butte in the south, and then one north of Kyle called Saltburn. So again, all these reservoirs, Saltburn, you can see it being built there. It's way up on a hill. So the idea was, you know, to minimize pumps running endlessly and chewing up power, is to try to locate reservoirs and design the system so that you could use the land, pump to a hill, and then let Mother Nature gravity feed to as many people as possible. So all these reservoirs are all on hills around in that area. Obviously, there was a lot that went into the organizational structure. This was a new entity, so they created a legal entity, these 4 municipalities. They had to hire staff. They had to set up their governance, you know. Each of them has a vote. So I think one of the bigger things is who is going to own all this infrastructure after $40-some million was built? You know, was each municipality going to own it, or were they going to buy in, I call it, were they going to put their utility hat on and let the utility own this infrastructure? And in the end, they got there. The utility's a legal entity, and the utility, SLRWPU, owns all this. So you can imagine you're starting a new entity, 4 municipalities from scratch, and they now own $45 million worth of assets on day one, you know? So there's a lot going on. There's a lot to think about. The utility has an administrator. That administrator is also administrator for one of the founding members. They obviously had to hire water operators, water managers. The board meets monthly. They have an O&M committee that meets separately. So again, this just kind of sums it up. They got 10 million from CSIF, 16 million from Building Canada Fund, and then the rural users, which is, this is where things, for lack of a better word, got dicey, you know, because there's a sweet spot on what people could afford, you know, what their comfort level and what they would actually put forward to pay for this. So it's 20,000 per user, whether you were on the edge of town or 50 miles away. It was the same. It was the same. So it had to be fair. They borrowed a significant amount to make up the balance to get this built. They did it, I think, very innovatively through municipal debentures. Now, I'm not a financial guy. Bev kind of painted a picture. I'm not an accountant, so I don't want to talk too much about that, but they did it through provincial municipal debentures, and I thought it was really innovative. And then, of course, they had to come up with a whole rate structure, so they're starting from scratch, you know. Rate structure, base rate, and usage. So for me, what made this project unique, working with numerous municipalities on the same project, and really, it's 7 years of my life that is out there in that countryside. I could pretty well tell you every nook and cranny out there. We constructed 2 new water plants from scratch. So neither of those communities, Kyle or Elrose, had a water plant. In their 100-year history, they didn't have a water plant. They were pulling water out of the ground through old wells, chlorinating it, drinking it. So it's not too often you get to build new water plants for communities that have been around that long and never had them before. Constructing a relatively large water system from scratch, 650 kilometers of water pipeline. So, you know, we could go on and on here, but it was a fun job, and it was 7 years of my life, and I wouldn't change any of it. There was a lot of bumps along the road, a lot of bumps, but in the end they got it done. They persevered, and they built a $40 million water system in rural Saskatchewan. And I think if you would have asked them if that was achievable in 2002, when they innocently got together to talk about getting better water for their communities, I think they would have fell off the back of their chair. But in the end, that's it in a nutshell. So luckily we were recognized too. So I think I'm going to turn it over to Sean now. So thanks for letting me run through that quickly.
Thank you very much, everybody. And Ryan, thank you very much for that presentation. As you can see from Ryan's presentation, larger regional projects certainly have many needs. They can cover vast geographical areas and include various types of technology and a lot of collaboration and working together on a project of that nature. Large construction, significant people involved, and I think it just, we really wanted to just, as AECOM, we really just wanted to present a real success story. I mean, in Saskatchewan, this is a significant success story. I think there's other success stories on the regional basis. In the province, I mean, you can take a look at a lot of the water work around the city of Saskatoon. You can look at that corridor between Moose Jaw and Regina. You can look at the regional landfill work that's been done over the last 2 generations, or last 2 decades. So, I mean, I think from our perspective, we wanted to present from AECOM a good, strong success story. So my topic today is not really targeted at engineering as much as just discussing the situation and trying to make people think. You know, both the folks up here as well as the representatives from SUMA. I mean, At the end of the day, you know, we're going to have a discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit about funding in general in the province. We're going to talk about the genesis of the actual issue. You know, some of our limitations in the province, as well as briefly some potential solutions to at least think about. It's not intended to be any kind of a, you know, a discussion on how fantastic engineers are, because everyone understands the realities. Everyone's trying to do their job. They're an important part of the group, but that's what we're trying to discuss here. And also including in the communications, our funding agency, as well as our regulatory body. So we started off, we've been working since early 2000s with Sask Water and the Water Security Agency on mutual technical exchange workshops every couple of years following Walkerton in particular. And the intention of this was to invite communities and have interdisciplinary dialogue, and it was focused for the first few biannual sessions really on the technical side of it. Back in March of this year, a decision was made to have a little bit more of an open discussion on alternative infrastructure funding approaches, including regionalization. And so back in March of 2017, we invited Sask Water folks, we had Water Security Agency folks, we invited communities, Sask Water and Wastewater Association, and we had presentations throughout the day. We had a panel, we had Alberta success stories, we had Saskatchewan success stories, we had regulatory participation, we had funding participation. And at the end of the day, it led to a real positive open dialogue. And so what we've gathered from that was that there were some major benefits to the discussion, and it thought that an open presentation and a panel such as this to SUMA made a lot of sense. And so that's really the genesis of today's discussion. So just some background information. I think everybody understands this, but I mean, the population of Saskatchewan, you know, is in that 1.15 range. You know, we've got, just on the water systems alone, about 750 regulated facilities. I mean, just in the last, 10 years, essentially, the population has grown 10 to 15%, which is really on the positive, but on the regulated facility side, we're still at that 750 marker. Now, if you compare that, say, not that everything has to be compared against Alberta, but if you compare those numbers to Alberta, and you look at a population of 3.5 to 4 times the population, yet you look at a regulated facility number of, 1/3 to 1/2 of that. It's something that is open for discussion, and folks have to recognize that. From an upgrade standpoint, I mean, historically, funding has been the driver to infrastructure projects. I mean, I think everybody in the room that's had an infrastructure project, it's pretty tough to get off the ground without infrastructure funding. And in Saskatchewan, there's some particular, areas, particularly in the north, it should have said the north, but also a little bit on the geographical side towards the southwest that has to be acknowledged as well. It makes it a little bit more challenging. Like from a population standpoint, as I mentioned, I mean, we've had that 15% growth over the last 10 years. It's been, significant throughout that Lloydminster-Estevan corridor, with a lot of growth around Saskatoon and Regina, and then Swift Current and Yorkton as well, having some growth initiatives. And I mean, if you think about it, not trying to get political or anything, I mean, we spent 70 years at about 1 million people, and then in the last 10 years, we've moved up, 150,000, and that's something that has to be acknowledged. From the standpoint of number of regulated facilities, I mean, we're talking about, a lagoon for every 1,500 people. You're talking about a water plant for every 1,500 people. And historically, I mean, with strong leadership and strong local champions on the operational side, I mean, we've been able to make it cost effective. But as the population, as I get into the demographics, as the population ages, and the regulatory requirements become greater, quite frankly, the question of whether it's sustainable really has to be talked about. So from a standpoint of historical leadership demographics, I mean, 1967 was the centennial for the country. A lot of infrastructure work was put forward in 1967, 68. You know, there's a lot of that money got put in, and design timelines on those were 30 to 40 years, right? And so I don't think it's any coincidence that a lot of the infrastructure challenges that happened that sprung regulatory issues also combined with the time that the design life of the original infrastructure started to slow down. In addition, strong political work at the local level is also, has to be acknowledged, right? And as well as seasoned operational staff, folks, in their 50s, 60s, 70s that have been champions in these communities. At the other end of the spectrum, you talk about increased regulatory oversight. I mean, we talked about Walkerton and the driver to upgrade water treatment from, in certain cases, particularly on groundwater, simply having to chlorinate to, upgrades in landfills. And now with wastewater effluent regulations, there's going to be a serious driver on the wastewater effluent approach that Ryan, I'm sure, will touch on. You've got a limited amount of money. You've got a limited amount of funding. I mean, I recall in my career, I've been in this industry 20 years. I spent 5 in the sales side of things. I spent 5 in the regulatory and 10 in the consulting industry. And so I understand, from when I was in the funding side of it, and I'd sit in on those funding meetings where you'd have $7 million asked for and you'd only have $1 million approved. And so, I mean, a lot of cases it was who can write the best proposal and who happens to get lucky that day. And I don't want to demean what Keith's talking about, but there's a lot of that involved in it. And at the same time, you still had to get the regulatory folks happy with you, right? So there's a lot of challenge there. On the regulatory side, there was also a demographic issue, and I'll just be blunt about it, a demographic issue in the early 2000s where, all of a sudden after Walkerton and North Battleford, all of a sudden the province started looking at facilities, right? The program that had been in place prior to that had really been kind of decimated, and there was like maybe 4 inspectors in the province, and then all of a sudden it went up to 20, 25, and you had a lot of older operators who certainly knew what they were doing under the historical regulatory regime, and then you had a bunch of younger regulators, and that created some natural tension and dysfunction within, trying to get folks to where they needed to be. So that's another issue. Because at the end of the day, it's fine and dandy for someone to come in and tell you what's wrong, but then the question always came back with, well, okay, are you going to give us some money to fix it? So there's that challenge as well. As we move forward, I think there's really a concern long term about the lack of certified operators that are going to be available. Like a lot of guys, as I mentioned earlier, and gals have been champions in their local communities and have gone through and got the certification, but they are aging, and to get folks on the younger basis to get in there and move in that direction and be comfortable with that career path, that's a challenge. And then on the wastewater side, you're going to see more and more challenges with regards to level certification. And I mean, I think folks know that you put an ad in the paper and you see if you can find a level 3 or level 4 operator, particularly on the wastewater side in Saskatchewan. So, I mean, that's an issue. From the funding standpoint and from the application standpoint, I mean, I think just functionally as a group between communities and the regulators and the funders and the engineers, there's, it's a real challenge, an issue happens and the knee-jerk reaction is to get funding out there and get it shovel ready as quickly as you can. And a lot of times what lacks is, some of the planning discussions that Ryan were talking about as far as what's the best interest of the community over the long haul. So, it's important to look at things from a life cycle cost perspective as much as anything. So, and then, like I mentioned, I mean, FFIB drove a lot of the funding. We got 30 to 40-year infrastructure that puts us into the late 90s to early 2000s. You get the challenges that happened there, more regulatory, and it's just like everything's hitting everything at once. I mean, having said that, over the last, like I look at the last 15 years as probably being the first part of a 30-year infrastructure expenditure requirement for the province. I really look at it, and I think we're just on the edge of the first half, and I think there's going to be another significant amount of money that's going to have to get spent to continue on. And but we can't say that nothing's been done, because there's been 2,500 projects worth $1 billion of infrastructure, and that's huge. But at the end of the day, there still is a deficit that exists, and we can't acknowledge that. So during discussions we've had, and during presentations, I mean, the old adage of, you know, whether grant programs is the best overall way to approach this utility, you know, whether it be water, wastewater, landfills, whether that's the best approach, really always comes up. Like, is that long-term, generations from now, is that the best approach? Versus the grant program, where unfortunately a lot of times, you know, I don't want to say bad actors, but maybe folks that haven't been as diligent on upgrading and understanding what the upgrades are needed would get rewarded with funding, whereas folks that have been, you know, a little more proactive might not have as much opportunity at funding. You know, that's something to think about. It'd be very, very difficult to change nowadays, but it's something to think about. So kind of getting towards my closing here, the reality is 15 years ago I would have said the number of facilities is just fine. We've got, what I worry about is the combination of the demographics in concert with the number of facilities that makes it challenging. I think there's been some missed opportunities. I think people get scared when they hear infrastructure sharing. I think they get scared when they hear regionalization, because I'm not always thinking of it from a one major plant distributing it to everybody, but also from a O&M standpoint. You know, establishing an entity that handles the O&M on 7 or 12 or 15 communities in an area where you can share those resources. That's as much on the regionalization approach as anything. It's not about hiring a bunch more engineers. It's almost about, okay, these are our utilities. This is what we're trying to do. How do we make sure there's an operator in Caryville at the same time that someone needs to check on some water in Manor? Those are the type of situations I think we have to address. You know, we have to adapt to the fact that the regulatory environment is not going to get less intense, right? Say if there's one regulatory change for the last 30 years, or for the first 30 years that it was going, then the next 30 years there'd be 20 changes. The next 30 years are going to be even more, because the reality is we got more people measuring, we got more analytical equipment that can measure whatever's going on in your water, whatever's going on in your wastewater, and that is eventually going to lead to more proactive regulatory approaches, and our infrastructure has to be fluid. We have to be able to understand and be flexible in that. We've got the rural demographic challenge. I mean, it's just the reality around the world is folks are moving into the centers. You got Saskatoon talking about a city of 500,000 that they're planning. You know, Regina's, you know, making significant investing with the expectation of continued growth. And then the bottom line is, I know I complain about it, I know my dad complains about it, I know everyone complains about water as the rates are going up. It's still probably undervalued as far as, I mean, when you compare it to putting a tank of gas in your vehicle. I mean, that's something that is always an open discussion. So from a potential solution standpoint, I mean, the one option certainly is status quo, you know, continue on, and the funders get the decision as to what drives. You know, the other option is you eliminate the funding programs. You know, maybe there's another option for you know, more targeted infrastructure funding. Maybe there's more, you know, an approach to get planning funded more readily, so folks can be proactive in that. But that's kind of the decision, and I'm also one of those guys that likes to lay blame as well. So I'm not immune to being one of those folks, and so I always like to say, okay, so what is the primary culprit? How did we get here? Right? Is it demographics? They're just people getting older? Well, that's kind of tough to blame people on. People just get older. Is it regulatory enhancements? Yeah, I mean, I'd love to throw Ryan under the bus in a heartbeat. you know, Ryan Evans from the regulatory, you know, we can blame them all we want. You know, we can also blame funding mechanism. We can blame Keith, you know, just by the way it's happening. You know, or we can just increase it from rural to urban. You know, just the actual, you know, transition that people have taken in the province to moving away from the farm, with farms getting bigger. Or really, is it senior hockey? At the end of the day, does it really come down to people still being mad about, you know, a hockey game that happened in 1975 and not being able to get along well enough? Is it that? I don't know, but I'm open to suggestions. Anyway, thank you very much. I'll let Keith take over from here.
Thanks, Sean, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks to SUMA and to AECOM for inviting me to be part of this group this afternoon. I want to provide a bit of a disclaimer and a bit of an out, frankly, for AECOM. We collaborated on this presentation, and ordinarily when I present, I make sure that all my slides have a Government of Saskatchewan logo on them so that you know where to place the blame if there's blame, and you know where to give the credit if there's credit. So we went past that this time. So the GOS content is on an AECOM slide template, but please don't hold that against them. If there's any questions that you have with respect to the information that I have today, please, or blame to be given, please make sure I get it and not AECOM. They were very gracious and very helpful in trying to pull all this together. So my job here this afternoon is to kind of be the third of the leg of the stool, maybe. I think Ryan did a great job of explaining to you that and kind of being the motivational side of it. Indeed, it can happen in rural Saskatchewan. You can take a 50 or a 45 or a $50 million project and get it done if you have the strength of character and the will to succeed. And Sean talked about some of the challenges that we're experiencing, and I'll be looking forward to hearing from you in your question and answer period about where your communities sit on some of these things and how you feel about inter-community cooperation and water rates that are at least as much as you pay for cable television, if not a little bit more. And it's not just about water and sewer. It's about a bunch of other things as well, and I acknowledge that. We'll speak a little bit about that too. But my job then today is to talk about the show me the money part. I want to talk about what are the current programs, because any conversation in this area does actually end up coming down to affordability, and I know folks are frustrated about how long it takes to get these programs up and running, how much it feels like a lottery. The SUMA president asked me as I was coming in today, said, did you bring me good news on the grant front, or am I back to buying lottery tickets? And I said, not yet. Don't have any good news yet, but don't buy lottery tickets. Well, go ahead and buy lottery tickets, I guess. If somebody wants to win, that's great. But let's not count on that. I want to talk about how much funding is in play, and because it is a very confusing area, and I think it's important for us to be transparent about, you know, what is there, when do we expect that it's going to be available, and some of those kinds of things. I want to talk about a little bit about the current need, and then from us, from the ministry's perspective, what's next. Sean spoke a little bit about some of the progress that we've made in the last number of years, and I know sometimes it feels like we're not spending enough, but what this slide does is just give you a bit of an idea of the programs that our ministry has administered over the course of the last 10 years, and almost 2,500 projects and well over $1 billion. That's just either provincial and or federal provincial money. So when you add at least probably more than half again that amount from the amount that municipalities put in, it's probably closer to $1.75 billion on municipal infrastructure over the last 10 years, which on the one hand is a ton of money, but on the other hand, folks say it's never enough, particularly when you get to the point of looking at the need that's still out there. But I wanted that slide up there just because of the context, and to let folks know that indeed there is some work being done. So what are we currently working with? Many of you will have heard about the Clean Water Wastewater Fund. It was a program that came as a part of the new federal government's first kind of kick at the can on infrastructure funding. Saskatchewan received $89.3 million of federal funding. That generated just about $177 million of project costs and about 100 projects in total. All of that money, it was a very short program. It was only a 2-year program, which just recently, those of you that have a project under Clean Water Wastewater would have been notified that we managed to get Canada to approve a 3rd year to the program because of timelines and folks weren't going to be done their projects in time. But it was a very short-term program, and it was as I said, the new federal government's attempt to kind of kickstart their involvement in this. And even though there were very short timelines, we did get 100 projects up and running on that. Those ones are all fully allocated. They're not done and not paid for yet, but the money has been fully allocated on that. We'll talk about other priorities, and you will see both on this slide and a little bit later when I talk about the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Plan, which is the newest iteration of federal support that's coming. Public transit is a big focus for federally. And the first tranche of the Public Transit Infrastructure Fund came out at the same time as the Clean Water Wastewater. It was $29 million, $57.4 million of total project costs, 14 projects. But those went primarily, obviously you have to have a public transit system in order to get money out of this. So Regina, Saskatoon, PA, and Moose Jaw were the big recipients of money underneath that program. Again, that's fully allocated. Projects are in progress. And many of them are just about done. There's only maybe, I think, $6 or $7 million of work yet left to be done in this coming fiscal year on those projects. So now you're saying, okay, well, tell us about where there is some money left, smart Alec. And that's in we do have money left in the New Building Canada Fund. So the New Building Canada Fund, and I know the acronyms are confusing, so I apologize for that, but those of us that deal with it every day call that's the old new. And the other is the new. So in the old New Building Canada Fund, there was 2 components. If you were tracking this, you'll recognize some of this. We had a small communities fund component that had $43.7 million in it, be matched by provinces and territories, so roughly $130-some million of projects will happen out of that. We've currently committed $17.3 million of that money, and there's $26.4 million left in that. So when you if you're doing the math in your head, 26.4 times 3, so roughly $75 million worth of projects that will proceed underneath the Small Communities Fund. Canada has asked that we commit this remaining funding by March the 31st. So the reason why you don't see any of my municipal infrastructure and finance folks here is because they've been working pretty much around the clock to try and figure out how we're going to commit to these projects. And again, understand that commit means submit to Canada for approval. It doesn't mean start. It doesn't mean approve. It doesn't mean dig the ground yet. It means signal that these communities are in play. The other half of the New Building Canada Fund was the NRP, the National Regional Projects component. That was the big one. There was 2 times 196.5 in that program, 300 and whatever that works out to, just over 400 million, just under 400 million. And half of that money was dedicated to municipal projects. We've committed about 100 million of it so far, about $96.1 million left. And again, that's one-third money. So probably close to $300 million worth of projects will be done in that. And we're in the same boat with this particular component as we are with the Small Communities Fund, that by March the 31st, we're going to be, we've been asked to submit a project list to Canada that will commit that money. So from a practical perspective, if and I know many of you will have projects that you've submitted for funding, we can't pay for that all at once. You can't afford to undertake it all at once. We don't have enough contractors and equipment in order to do it all at once. So that money is going to flow out over the course of the next number of years. And once we get an indication from Canada how they feel about the projects we've submitted, then we're going to have to do some work with communities to try and stage this and figure out, what do we do in the next couple of years and what do we do in the couple of years after that. Don't forget about the good old gas tax fund. $59 million of federal funding came to your communities in 17-18. We also distributed a $1.2 million top-up also occurred in this year. So if your administrators were wondering why they got a check from us for about as many people as you had in your community multiplied by $1.20, that's what that was. And we've budgeted for about $61.2 million out to your communities. This is a straight per capita funding program. Your administrators will know that they submit infrastructure investment plans for this money, and it's just about the easiest and quickest infrastructure money that you can get. We watch over from an interest perspective, not from a control perspective, hundreds of projects underneath this, and communities really do a good job of making good use of this money. I would be remiss if I didn't give a plug for the Saskatoon North Commuter Bridge project. If you're paying attention to when Minister Cowitz was Minister of Finance, he announced a few years ago that there was going to be a $50 million contribution to the North Commuter Bridge. We paid half of that. I expect to, well, it's always you know what's happened in the last couple of weeks. We haven't got our budget approved yet for this year, but I expect that we'll be fulfilling that commitment in 18-19 and giving Saskatoon the last half of the provincial commitment to that, which is probably good news for their new city manager, whoever that might be. And then we get to where the real gravy is the investing in Canada. That's the newest. Used to be called Phase 2, then it was called, now it's called the Investing in Canada Plan. And those of us that deal with it, this is the new. And we still call it Phase 2 most of the time. Saskatchewan will get $896 million from Canada in 4 different streams. Again, public transit, as I mentioned, a high priority from the federal perspective, $307.8 million for public transit. There's a green/climate change component, which is where the bulk of the water and wastewater and those sorts of projects will come, $416 million. There's a community culture and recreation component, $56 million, and a rural and northern communities component for just under $116 million. These figures are just federal. We've got lots of work to do on, in fact, we meet with our colleagues at the federal level almost weekly on this. We're in the middle of negotiating an integrated bilateral agreement, so there'll be one agreement between Canada and Saskatchewan where all 4 of those funding streams are embedded within it. And part of that work involves us as officials making recommendations to our elected about what the provincial share should be, how much should go to municipal projects, because again, that's a provincial allocation. So a shameless plug for my work on your behalf. I'm in tight with the Ministry of Highways and Advanced Education and all that. So if you've got a good word to say about a municipal project, you know who's going to be here in the next couple of days that you'll want to buttonhole. We also have to work out don't tell anybody I said to do that, okay? Please don't do that. Most of you have heard me speak before. I know I'm just teasing half the time, but no, actually we are doing a ton of work on this, and we hope over the coming months then we'll get some of these answers about, you know, are Canada is putting in 50% on the rural and northern. What's the provincial share going to be then? What a rural and northern community is going to have to look at? Are we going to put in a third? It's not likely, frankly, that we'll put any money into the public transit again, but you never know. So those are the questions and the advice that we're in the process of giving our elected right now. Application dates and processes, again, none of us can afford to undertake all of these projects at once. I have to submit budget proposals the same way that your administrators advance budget proposals to you as elected folks. And so we'll be looking for direction over the next, while it's a 10-year program, so we'll be looking at something that's affordable and something that we can do over the course of the coming years in cooperation with you. So what are we looking at out there? What do we already know is out there? When we did the intake in January of 2017 in preparation for a whole bunch of stuff, we gave communities a maximum of 2 applications each. So I know that there's many communities out there that had to choose, had to prioritize your projects. And that's not a bad thing. Those are decisions that you have to make as well. But I know that there's a ton of culture and rec projects and a ton of road projects and a ton of other sorts of infrastructure priorities that you have in your communities that you still are aware of, but I'm not. But from my perspective, I know that I've got over 400 applications that are sitting with us at this point, and they're well over $1 billion worth of infrastructure. And as Sean said, one of the challenges that we have is to try and then rate them and try and figure out, you know, if you got $10 to spend and you got $100 worth of need, where do you put the $10 to try and figure out the best bang for your buck? And it is again, a plug for my folks. They work very hard on this, and they owe a great debt of gratitude to their colleagues at the Water Security Agency. We go through an exhaustive process of trying to figure out where the provincial share, or where as a province we can get the best bang for our buck on this. And I know that it's frustrating for communities to not get good news, and that it takes so long. But you can see, even just at this point, well over 400 projects that I know of that are, you know, more or less ready to go, and that doesn't count waste management. It's a big and important priority, way more than it was even 10 years ago for us. So I suspect that somewhere along the line we're going to have a project intake that's dedicated to landfills and solid waste management. But again, we'll take your advice on that too. I don't even have a clear scope on the need for culture and recreation facilities, but we know it's significant. Not a day goes by, hardly a day, not a week goes by that Jason Chernenko from Wynyard doesn't phone me about his rink, because he's got me on speed dial, and I don't know why he does that. But anyway, it's hopefully we'll be able to address some of those needs over the next little while. And again, that doesn't talk about roads and disaster mitigation and bridges and all of the other things that rural municipalities and urban municipalities have in common. As I mentioned, getting the best bang for our buck has always been important, but it's probably more important now than it ever has been. And I guess that's one of the things that I'll be interested to hear what you folks have got to say when it comes to the Q&A about how you feel about working together with your neighbors, or working regionally, or you know, us taking a firmer hand from either a planning or a regional perspective, or even an affordability perspective, and making some changes that might help make some of this landscape on this a little clearer. What's next for us? Again, as I mentioned, we'll have to look at committing the remainder of the old New Building Canada Fund money by the 31st of March. That's about 122.4 or whatever the numbers added up, 2 million. Again, that's 1/3 money, so you're looking at probably $330-some million worth of projects that we'll commit to, but won't happen right away. It has to be done in an affordable manner. And we'll also be consulting with the sector and the elected, both municipally and provincially, on implementation, on the cash flow, on the new programs. We have to talk about the impact and the opportunities for the municipal sector. Do we start pushing in one way or another, or do we prioritize in a different way? And we clearly have to talk about acting regionally and working together and seeing what we can do to try and make it easier for communities to try and achieve some of their goals in a more efficient way. So it sounds like a lot of money, and I'll be interested in and hopefully be able to answer the questions that you have about timing and all the rest of those kinds of things when the time comes. But if now you get to talk to I'm the nice part. I have the money a little bit. Now you talk to the bad guy, but he's a great guy, a friend of mine, Ryan Evans from the Water Security Agency. Talk about the regulatory side of things.
Well, thanks, Keith. And I wanted to start out by thanking SUMA and AECOM for giving me the opportunity to come and talk to you folks. I'm going to be talking specifically on regionalization. But before we get into it, I just want to make it really, really clear here. WSA supports regionalization. We think that it's a good way of maximizing a small amount of money and trying to get as much bang for your buck as you can. But we're not forcing regionalization, and I want to be really clear on that. If you apply for a permit, if you meet our regulatory requirements, if you meet our design standards, you get a permit regardless if it's an individual system or a regional system. So just to get that out of the way. But with that being said, I wanted to talk about why we think it is a good opportunity. So the first reason that I want to talk about is the ever-tightening regulatory requirements. You've heard it a couple of times already today. What used to be okay 20 or 30 years ago isn't okay anymore. The technology we have for monitoring for contaminants is improving. The technology we have for removing contaminants is improving. As that changes, things become more strict. As an example, in 2012, the federal government came out with new regulations that applied to wastewater treatment systems that discharge to fish-bearing water. In particular, there were a couple of contaminants like CBOD, TSS, and unionized ammonia that hadn't been captured for systems that were discharging fish-bearing water if you had, say, a seasonal lagoon system, but now will be captured, and it will likely mean that a number of facilities are going to have to be upgraded to meet those kinds of requirements. The federal regulations apply down to a size of influent of 100 cubic meters per day, which doesn't really mean a lot, but to give you a ballpark estimate on it, it's kind of the villages of 250 people or more. It's also important to know, though, that there was a municipal wastewater effluent strategy came out that had pretty similar requirements that applied all the way down to 10 cubic meters per day, or communities about the size of 25 people. And Saskatchewan actually signed on to that municipal wastewater effluent strategy. So we're, even though there are federal regulations, the next point is Saskatchewan changed the provincial regulations to include a lot of those same requirements. We don't have a cutoff for how small a community can be to not be captured if they're discharging fish-bearing water, but we do use as a policy that 10 cubic meter a day. So down to the 25-person villages, or at that point, it could even be an unorganized hamlet. And again, this is meaning more strict discharge requirements on wastewater facilities. In addition, on the provincial side of things, we have a requirement for a downstream use and impact study. What that does is it looks at where's your effluent going, what's downstream from you, and then setting site-specific requirements, usually around nutrients, so phosphorus or nitrogen, to make sure that you're protecting the people and the uses downstream. But again, these are requirements that didn't used to exist and are more strict than what used to be the case. And all in all, what it's meaning is if you have a wastewater facility and if you discharge to fish-bearing water, you're going to be having to meet more strict requirements, and there's a pretty good likelihood if you've got a lagoon, you're going to be looking at doing some kinds of upgrades. Now to continue this, it's not just on the wastewater side that changes are happening. On the drinking water side, the acceptable level of parameters in drinking water continues to shrink. So an example right now that's happening is Health Canada is looking at manganese. Manganese right now is an aesthetic objective, which pretty much means to this point, Health Canada has said you should try to get manganese out of your water, because if you don't, it's going to stain your fixtures and cause some aesthetic problems. They're changing their thinking on it now to where it will actually become a maximum acceptable concentration, meaning Health Canada is now going to be saying you have to get manganese out of your water because it's a health problem if you drink it. So you can see there, that's quite a big shift in thinking. And in Saskatchewan, we actually have a lot of communities that deal with manganese. And again, is going to mean that we're going to have a lot of upgrades just to try to keep up with these requirements that keep becoming more and more strict. And I guess from the regulatory side of things, would it be easier if we had fewer facilities that needed to upgrade than we currently have? The second reason I want to talk about that I think is useful for regionalization is around the ability to attract and retain qualified operators. So as you're being required to upgrade your facilities, as facilities are expanding, they're getting more complex, the classification level of those facilities is going up. That in and of itself isn't a problem, except when you start looking at the number of certified operators we have in Saskatchewan. As of March 31st, 2017, we had about 1,343 certified operators, which I actually think is a really healthy number of operators, really. But if you look at the slide here, what happens when we get to those class 3s and class 4s? You actually have a really small pool of certified operators at those levels. So as facilities become more complex, if we're getting into a spot where we have more class 3s and class 4 facilities popping up, we're now in a spot where we have got more facilities, we have more jobs, but there aren't enough people to actually attract and be able to maintain, oh, and there goes the slide, maintain the appropriate certified operators. There we are. The last advantage that I want to talk about is on the economic side of things. And I'm not saying that regionalization makes economic sense for every project, but I think that there are a number of cases where it does make some really good sense, and I'd want people to at least be considering it. So to start off with, let's talk about upgrading the existing facilities. So that could be because regulatory requirements have become more strict. But it also could be because, as Sean mentioned in his part of the presentation, a lot of our water plants and sewage lagoons were built in the 60s with a design life of 30 to 40 years. We're now 50 years into that cycle. So a lot of facilities need to be upgraded just to maintain what they were, let alone any kind of additional requirements. So in Saskatchewan, we have 836 regulated waterworks and 603 regulated wastewater works. In my mind, that's a huge number. And when we start talking about needing to upgrade all of those facilities, there is a really big infrastructure deficit in this province. And I think it becomes especially highlighted when we have new funding opportunities like Keith talked about. There are some funding, and I don't know the specifics, so ask Keith for specifics, but my understanding was there was a 10-year program that came in that had multiple intakes. On the first year, on the first intake, there was already a request for more money than was going to be available over the 10-year program. Obviously, we don't have enough money to pay for all of those projects, so what do? If we had fewer facilities, would it mean it's a little bit easier to allocate that money? Would it mean that our dollars go a little bit farther when we do allocate money? And the last thing that I want to talk about on the economic side of things is economies of scale. I think we can all appreciate that, right? Building one large facility that meets requirements is less expensive than building 2 or 3 or 4 facilities that provide that same level of capacity. Sean also mentioned it's important to take into account your operations and maintenance, which again is a really good point. You have 2 facilities, you've got more operations and maintenance than you would if you had one bigger facility that produced the same amount of water. So we also run into situations where we have a number of communities that are all dealing with the same issue. This is, if we talk about Ryan's part of the presentation, Sask Landing, they had lack of access to a good quality source water. In the southwest part of the province, it's not uncommon to have to dig down 500 plus feet to get a well that has water, and when you do get water, you might not have the greatest quality of water. So does it make sense to be drilling a whole bunch of smaller wells and building a whole bunch of plants to deal with similar quality issues? Or would it make more sense to build fewer bigger wells to provide your quantity and fewer bigger water treatment plants to deal with that water quality issue? On top of it, it's not just in the southwest. We've got pockets of the province that have high arsenic in their water, that have high manganese in their water, or high ammonia. Now, these problems aren't difficult to deal with. They're not complicated, but they are expensive. And again, it's one of those things, does it make sense to have a lot of little expensive plants, or can we see some savings by having some regional solutions? And the last thing I want to talk about is, again, around that dedicated, or is still on the economic side of things, but it's to do with more of the operation and maintenance side of things, and even staffing, right? So if we're looking at class 3 or 4 operators, we're not talking about towns competing with towns for staff or villages with staff. We're talking about towns competing with Saskatoon and Regina for staff. Communities that may have significantly higher budgets to try to hire operators. So if you have fewer larger systems, maybe you can afford to have dedicated staff that just do the water treatment plant, and you can split those costs among all of the communities that are participating. The same thing goes for the operation and maintenance side of things. I wanted to talk, though, we do have a fair number of success stories actually on the regional side of things in the province. There's the Sask Landing project that Ryan was talking about. There's the Dundurn Rural Water Utility. They actually have a rural wastewater utility in that area too. Sask Water has a number of systems. They got pipelines coming off of Saskatoon, pipelines coming off of Buffalo Pound. They also have their own water treatment system and pipelines around the Waka-Humboldt area. And I wanted to highlight, just because I know that my talk is almost entirely water, wastewater, because it's what I do, but we also have regional landfills in the province. And I think those have been a pretty successful project where we, again, on the landfill side, we used to have a lot of landfill facilities, and we've reduced the number of landfills, and we've added more transfer stations, and we've gotten to those larger regional facilities, and I think it's a really good way of highlighting what can come out of regional projects. In the interest of time, I'm not going to talk too much here. I wanted to go through a couple of areas, because people always ask, well, so what would be some good areas for regionalization? The two that popped in my mind are east of Regina and the Weyburn-Estevan corridor. East of Regina, there's Balgonie, there's White City, there's Pilot Butte, there's the RM of Edenwald that all have wastewater issues. City of Regina also is considering building a second wastewater plant in that same area. So just the question, does it make sense to have 4 or 5 advanced wastewater treatment systems in that little area? Does that make sense? Or could we maybe build one solution that would solve all of those problems? On the Weyburn-Estevan corridor, it's more around raw water quality and the need to improve the raw water quality so that they don't have trihalomethane issues. Estevan recently got funding to build a new intake that'll solve Estevan's problem. But if Weyburn has the same problem, if the communities in between have the same problems, could we have knocked out a few problem communities with one set of funding instead of trying to just deal on a one-off scenario? So anyway, sorry for going quickly here. I'm just trying to stick to timelines. So I wanted to thank you for listening to my presentation and all of our presentations. Thanks again to SUMA for inviting us out to talk. We're going to be opening it up to questions now, but before we do that, I just wanted to I've got this nice opportunity with a lot of folks here, so I wanted to take the chance. WSA, we're promoting regionalization, but we're not really doing anything beyond promotion right now. And I guess the question is there something as the regulator, do you folks see a way that we could be facilitating regionalization a little bit more than just trying to get up and promote it? Anyway, I'll open it up now for some questions, but thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, everyone. If you have a question, please come up to the microphone. Now's your opportunity to ask questions. Don't be shy. No questions?
Well, thanks.
Yeah. Do you want to make some comments? Anybody? Further comments? Or oh, great. Come on up.
Hi, Connor Katurks from the town of Midale. I'm actually in the Estevan-Weyburn corridor.
Do you want to just pull the mic up a little bit? State your name and your municipality for the recording, if you could. Does it come up a little bit? Maybe not. Hey!
Connor Katurks, town of Midale. I'm actually in the Estevan-Weyburn corridor. I'm just wondering, how do we, because we have been applying for a regional water system in that area. I'm just wondering, how do we become more competitive in applying or make our application more appealing? Because 8+ years of applications, so just wondering on how we would address that situation to try and get water going.
So,
Press the button, Keith. I think you have to press the button.
I'm green. Can you hear me?
Good.
Go up to the podium.
I'm glad I'm not the only one that has trouble.
Yeah.
If you want to appear,
Can you hear me?
Keith, if this is easy. Yeah.
Sure, I'll try. So I get that question a lot, right? How can we make our application stand out from the crowd? How can we, will it help if we phone the minister? Yeah, I tease Jason, will it help if he phones me every week and reminds me that he's still out there? Honestly, it really is not, it's not a question of trying to make your application more attractive. Here's the process that we go through when we try to evaluate applications. Now, I won't go into it in detail, but I'll try and, the answer should illustrate why, making sure that it's double-spaced with no grammatical or punctuation mistakes, that's not as important as, what the information that's in it. We look at how much, what's the bang for the buck? We got a $30 million project that benefits 3,000 people, or a $30 million project that benefits 130,000 people. That goes into the evaluation. what's the sustainability of the system itself? What are the sizes of the communities? What are the current water rates? What are the is it a good investment from the perspective of the program side of things? We also look at growth patterns. Communities growing, communities shrinking. What are the economic development opportunities that we see going out over the course of the next little while? A big one is, are there public safety concerns? Things that could cause, for example, another Walkerton or another North Battleford situation. So we've got probably 12 or 14 different attributes, and then one of them is regional. Obviously, one of them is where you get bonus points is if it's actually a true regional project. And when we say true regional project, it's more than just having a letter of support from the RM or a letter of support from the community down the road or from the Chamber of Commerce or whatever. When we talk about regional, it means do you have financial partners? Also, the affordability from the perspective of the community. What's your debt load? Can you afford to pay it back? So there's a rigorous process that we go through when we evaluate these applications. And again, frankly, it also comes down to how much money do we have, right? So we try to evaluate the projects. We talk to our colleagues at the Water Security Agency, and they give us some comments on the engineering side of things. They also talk about any problems that the communities may have had with respect to the operating permits and other health and safety concerns. And we try and balance all of that together and compare it to the amount of money that we have. So frankly, what it comes down to is you take all of those things in and everybody gets a score. So maybe you got a 72 out of 100. And then what we do is we work our way down the list and we try to assign the best mix. We also have to worry about geographic. We also have to worry about when was the last time your community got support, because we want to try and be fair and as democratic as we can in the context of the money that we've got. So I understand where you're coming from when you say try and make it more attractive, but it's really not a question of it being a cool application for me. It's more cut and dried than that. And in the case of the Mydale project, one of the things that has held us back so far, frankly, has been the size of the project. It's like a $55 million or $50 million project, and it's an expensive piece. And for me to, part of it is affordability. But that said, I already went through where we're looking at, and I think that some of those larger projects, particularly where there's a regional focus, is I would like to hear from you folks. If should we be telling our elected, or should you be telling me to tell my elected that we need to focus on communities that are cooperating, or on communities where there's growth, or communities where that start with the letter M, whatever the priority is. Well, and there'll also be anybody that cheers for the Patriots won't be getting anything, but that's okay.
And look at behind you.
Okay. All right, thanks.
Well, a few things back.
Just state your...
Gary Philipchuk, City of Warman. A few things. Whether I was going to mention Sask Water, but I think a little bit with the funding, because it does feel like a lottery, and I wish it didn't feel like a lottery, and I wish we could find a system that would work in a better way. I know back with recreation, when we built our recreational complex, we were ones that didn't get money, and that still bothers me about that part, and I see some recreation money there. I'm just wondering, is there a way of setting it up? It's almost like guaranteed loans. Like if a community can take this on and have the 0% loan to pay off, so you're sort of recycling money, maybe some grant, but more of a loan program that allows people to build what their communities need. And I'm even thinking of this type of infrastructure. It's the biggest problem we have is we want a 15-year loan. We don't know what this interest rates are going to be in the long period. So if we had something dealing with the risk, we could take on more of those types of projects. I definitely believe in the regionalization. We want the money going in those areas. I mean, we're working hard with our neighbors right now, and we're having very good conversations about dealing with some of that. We're not sure where Sask Water plays in the whole role of that area, and we're having those conversations too. But I guess a completely new structure in some ways, and I know I'd taken that to the feds back about 10 years ago when we were looking at trying to build a recreational complex. And actually the provincial government, we met with Premier Wall at the time, and it came out with a 0% loan for 5 years because they'd seen we'd been missed. But we're thinking a 15-year 0% loan, we still have to own it, we still have to pay it back, but it allows us to maybe move our community forward in the way we see fit.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, and we did actually run the SIGI program, the Saskatchewan Infrastructure Growth Initiative, where we provided interest subsidies to communities that were undertaking those sorts of projects, and that did work fairly well. That program has since ended, but it's something that those of us that have been around for a while still think of as being, I think it really did help a lot of communities. The notion of having kind of like an endowment fund where we to use the interest, that's been advanced as well. Frankly, I don't hear from many communities that have trouble getting capital money or borrowing. There's the Municipal Finance Corporation. There's often local lenders that are equally eager. There's not very much safer risk than a municipal corporation. I don't think in Saskatchewan's history, maybe Ralph, you could help me remember, I don't think we've ever seen a community default. We've never actually been in a situation where the province has had to step in and backfill a community. So, but again, from a sure, let's talk about it perspective, I'd be more than happy to sit down and chat with you and your colleagues. We're in the process of designing these new programs, so if there was some new sort of approach, and again, I hope it. I understand what you say when you say it feels like a lottery, but trust me, it's not nearly as easy as picking names out of a hat. There's a good deal of a structure and rigor and due diligence that goes into it, and again, arguably it would be easier to do if there's more money to go around, and I think that's maybe what makes it feel like a lottery.
Hello, Jonathan Torson, City of Lloydminster. I actually just had a comment more so because I am kind of a numbers guy, but keep in mind that I may have the Alberta and Saskatchewan rules confused here. But on the utility corporation side, when you have several municipalities partnering up, one of the advantages of that is if it's under 50% ownership of any municipality, then it doesn't go against the municipality's debt limit. So all of that debt stays within the utility corp, and then you would only have share ownership, and at the end of the day that would give you more debt limit to do other projects as well. And then you would build your rates in a way that would both pay back that debt as well as have some level of profit so you can pay for future expansion and future cost increases, and then you can also have the amortization and depreciation covered off through your rates. Just a comment. Thank you.
Any further questions? Yes. Just state your name and municipality, please.
Glenn Baxter, Village of Elmarie, 100 residents, or 100 homes. We are facing the infrastructure change of 2 new sewer lagoons. And my question is, engineering fees are such a high fee. Is there any way they can amalgamate engineering so that they're not reinventing? It seems to be we're proving that water runs downhill consistently across the province at $50, $20, $30, $5,000 every time the engineering comes and makes a presentation to the council. And it feels like it's so straightforward. When we stand in the field and look at the situation, I think 3 people could have made the decision with the right education without the terrible high engineering costs.
That's not my question. Anyone want to venture into that water? Go ahead, Sean. Does that?
That's a very good question. I mean, I think coming from a small community myself, growing up in a small town where I've spent a lot of time, I know in going back to work in those communities, you know, after adult beverage or 2, I get the odd comment that, you know, I played hockey with you, I got drunk with you, you know, what are you talking about, you're worth $180 an hour or something like that. And my comment back is always, number 1, I'm certainly not making that kind of money, right? You're more than welcome to take over my 1978 Glencairn mortgage and my 2005 CRV anytime you want to. But it's essentially the establishment of the business of engineering is rates, and in order to ensure the liability is taken care of, and in order to ensure that staff grows so that and learns, to ensure that the skill set is available that's where those rates come from. I totally understand when it comes to asking somebody, you know, I was part of the Water Security Agency when the first water system assessments came out, right? And, you know, trying to package or jumble those assessments into something that would make sense from an economic standpoint. And I can pretty much guarantee you everybody lost some money on those to get those to something where the market will dictate. And I know that's not the answer you want to hear. I think a lot of it, in my mind, is building the relationship with an engineer, with one engineer, when it ends up becoming more of a commodity, when it ends up becoming, you know, this guy's $4,500, this guy's $4,600, this guy's $4,950. You know, you're going for the lowest price. A lot of times what I would suggest is getting to know the engineer that you're going to deal with. A generation ago, I mean, you drove down Highway 16 or you drove down Highway 11 and, you know, that community had been dealt with from one engineering firm for an entire generation. The same thing on the other end. And so that reinventing of the wheel did not have to take place because you could just make a phone call and say, okay, you've been out here for 20 years, you've been dealing with it for 20 years, give me an answer, straight shooting answer. And, you know, as far as, you know, meetings and having to pay for meetings, et cetera, I mean, there's nothing wrong with having somebody on a phone so that you're not paying for that time in a vehicle. So I understand where you're coming from. It's just, at the end of the day, it can't be viewed as strictly a commodity, so. I don't know if I did that. I tried.
And just to add to that, again, to give you the regulatory perspective on this, we do have design standards. We have standards for how to size a lagoon. We have standards for the type of liner you need. The issue comes down to, but they're not site specific. So you go to Val-Marie, maybe you've got fantastic clay, but if you go to Regina Beach, they're trying to build in sand. If you look at groundwater, you know, how deep is it to groundwater in different areas? How quickly is the population growing in the town? How much water use? So there's a lot of really case-by-case type of information that needs to be gathered for the specific community so that we can design it properly. If we had to set, as WSA, if we had to set the minimum, you know, one design standard that was going to apply everywhere, we would have to make sure that that design standard worked everywhere. And in Val-Marie, you might be held to the city of Regina's standard because Regina discharges a lot of volume into a pretty small creek. That's not what you're going to have to get to if you do this on a case-by-case basis. So we do try to provide flexibility. It does mean a little bit more planning at the start, but it should mean that you get a solution that's actually tailored to your community instead of just being overkill, you know, 95% of the time, because you have to make sure that that other 5% is covered off.
Okay, so I don't see any further questions unless anybody has one. No? Okay. So thank you. Let's give a round of applause again to our presenters. Thank you so much for being here today. I want to thank the lady at the back who's been managing the door while we've been changing sessions, so thank you for that. So thanks again to our sponsor, ISL Engineering, and thank you all for joining us today. Enjoy the rest of convention. Remember that the presentations will be available on SUMA's YouTube channel, and the next session starts at 2:45, and then maybe we'll see you all tonight at the welcome reception at new Mosaic Stadium.